Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Just doing a short video remoting into one of my Gentoo Linux machines. That's my old Intel Skylake system build with a quad-core i5. And it's not hyper-threaded. But that's not really the point of what I'm doing this. It's running reliably, everything's working good. But, I use, as you can see, the Gentoo distribution kernel. And it has some nice framework tools to make maintaining your kernel and the init RMFS automated. And one of the commands to regenerate the init RMFS is what we're going to use here right away. So what I want to do first is I want to, just to display this, I've cleaned this up previously, but now we're going to remove the older kernel version files. So I only have the current stuff. So I'll have the kernel binary image file. The config file for that kernel, right? And here we have the init RMFS file, and that was created with Dracut, which is the Linux kernel's official config file, or not config file, init RMFS file generator. Basically, it runs a bunch of utilities and stuff to start the machine and boot all of the different disks. Like, for example, this machine has a ZFS pool for the boot pool, because I do that quite frequently. I've been using ZFS for probably about 4 or 5 years on a bunch of different systems. Very reliable, but even reliability is the result of good maintenance and using functional, reliable software versions. So occasionally, even though something is stable, you might need to use, oops, I typoed that. You might have to use a release candidate software version for the purposes of progress, to have a new feature available, right? Like this is definitely like a pre-release of Dracut, but it's necessary for a reason that I may not immediately understand, but was determined to be beneficial by the software developers. And that's a gray area, really, to get in the middle of. Right? So, in this case, I may have, no, I didn't. There was, you can still use the old version with this too, right? If you really needed to. So, a 7th revision of a stable release versus a release candidate would be ideal. So, oops. So I'm going to regenerate a new init RMFS file to update it. And this is usually done independent of user intervention. When kernel or software driver versions are updated with Gentoo and you're using this distribution kernel with some configuration, you can have this distribution kernel framework maintain one of several bootloader configurations and the init RMFS automatically. And that companion package for the kernel package that does that is called install kernel. And this system runs ZFS, right? So I don't use a bootloader. I use EFI stub boot. It's direct direct ZFS boot. And I want to get rid of that older bootloader entry. So we're going to do 0001 b.b. There. And now the third one is set as the first boot order. And it will boot that, right? So just loads the Linux kernel directly, starts up, loads ZFS, away you go, desktop, web server, all the other good fun stuff. And you know, the first thing to load is always that init.rmfs file. And if it's outdated, then you know, you might have problems with firmware loading, like Linux firmware. With an AMD processor, provides the CPU microcode, and when Dracut generates the init.rmfs, that CPU microcode is included in the init.rmfs, and it's the first thing loaded when the machine boots for security reasons. Right? Now, if your Linux kernel doesn't use kernel modules, then all of this doesn't work. It will not load the firmware files because the driver loads before the firmware can be loaded. And we'll consider that complete. And then, you know, all of your drivers that rely on firmware will all, of course, cause errors and not work, and it's all kind of fun stuff. So, you know, modules are magnificent. Modularity is the design of Linux. It's kind of the way that it works, of course. You know, there's some situations where perhaps that's not desirable, and you could make like custom stuff and build all your firmware in, but the more custom you have, believe me, from somebody who's using Gentoo for 20 years, the more effort it is to maintain something, right? So, you know, you would have installed Linux firmware or Intel microcode, which is the Intel CPU microcode patch files. And then when your kernel init.rmfs is regenerated by Dracut doing this, right? You can see, if you look really closely, it goes through trying to detect all of the various things that may be needed, and you know, whether those are needed or not installed, it will still succeed based on what it discovers, which can also be, you know, CPU microcode files, and it includes that in generating a new init.rmfs and then compressing it. And I just use gzip because it's a multi-threaded decompression utility that's so ubiquitous and universal that it should never be a reason why an init.rmfs did not succeed functioning. I don't know, if you tried to make an init.rmfs and you used like Z standard, your kernel has to include all of those extra files to provide that functionality, and perhaps that might not work if your init.rmfs or your kernel build and system didn't include those utilities as well. So the compression sometimes takes a few minutes. I don't believe this system is really very busy, but it is only a quad core, an i5 6600K. So this is Dracut. This is what Dracut does. Goes through and copies files, and you know, it makes here's the early CPIO. That's the file for the kernel or CPU microcode. That will be the first file that's loaded ever when this init.rmfs is supposed to boot. So, and there we go. We have, updated it RMFS, and it updated the config and the other stuff, and there you go. That's see, and you can see, like, when that boots, it will boot that microcode is the first thing that loads before anything, before it starts accessing any sort of memory. That's secure. Compile long and prosper.